so much for joining us. My name is Jen Sato. I work with CLearn as a disaster consultant with LSU. And today we're going to be talking about disaster resilience and coalition building, which is definitely a really good way to kind of open our conversation over the next 4 weeks about what disaster resilience is. And we're going to talk today about those kind of foundational elements and build towards a larger picture as we go on in these 4 weeks. Also, excuse me, I have a cold, so if I cough or sniffle, I'm really sorry, and please excuse any background honking. I'm in New York, and it's almost constant. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. So when we're looking at disaster, I think a good place to look is the last, we could say 3 years, or we're in 2019 now, but 2017 and 2018 were the costliest years on record for natural disaster. 2019 numbers obviously aren't complete yet, but in the last 6 months, we've had 33 disaster declarations in the US, 2 of which were in Louisiana and only a couple days ago, one being May 28th, the other being June 2nd, and that was related to tornadoes and heavy rain. And most of these disasters actually occurred in California. There were 5 disaster declarations related to floods. So the question we're going to be asking as we move forward is, knowing that we had 2 very active years, especially in the state of Louisiana and across the nation, how can we help improve disaster outcomes and prepare our clients, agencies themselves, as we continue to face natural disaster events? Again, 2017, 2018, when you look at disaster records, and FEMA also keeps a list of disaster declarations, it is active, nominally larger than any year on record. So when we're talking about, I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm not sure if you can see that. When we're talking about disaster resilience, there is some base knowledge that we need to get acquainted with. Generally, there are 5 recognized stages of disaster. Some countries and some agencies split this into more categories, and some combine this. Some say it's only 3. But for the most part, when we're looking at disaster resilience, we talk about 5 stages, starting with prevention. Preparation, prevention, response, recovery, and mitigation. This picture shows it in a wheel, but I'm sure as many people know who live in, states of high risk like Louisiana, it doesn't always move like this. They don't always infer upon each other or make impacts laterally. And currently 85% of the population of Louisiana is actually in what we consider active recovery from disasters, whilst working with this entire wheel. So we have a wide range of activities happening specifically in the state of Louisiana, but a majority of the population is actually still working in active recovery. So you can imagine the challenges that come with trying to manage this sort of cycle whilst being in a perpetual state of recovery. There we go. So speaking specifically about New Orleans, we have experienced pretty much everything you can experience. Hurricanes, flooding, flash flooding, unexpected rain events, heat waves, high-risk freeze events, and tornadoes. 6 of these occurred in those last 2 years. So we're talking 2017, 2018. Again, in the last couple of months, we've had extensive flooding, tornado warnings. If any of you are signed up for NOLA Ready, you may notice there's been a lot of activity in the last couple of weeks, a lot of sudden rain events, a lot of tornado warnings, tornado touchdown warnings, electrical storms. One disaster that is not listed amongst the disasters experienced in the city is also fire. Swamp fire of 2012 was actually a very significant event, so that should be considered included in the list. So state hazards also include, and I'm sure everyone is familiar, again, we have wildfire and marsh listed there, dam and levee failures, hazardous material incidents. The Mississippi River is one of the most trafficked bodies of water when it comes to transportation of goods and materials. The Mississippi, especially, the old port of New Orleans, sees very high levels of materials from exported materials. So that's always a consideration. And of course, storm surge and subsidence. So New Orleans is also considered a city of high risk. We're going to be looking at a very interesting analysis. It's called a CRSI, which I'll have on the next slide, but we are considered a city of very high risk and low resilience. This is based on analysis of 5 particular factors. And, in some cities, these factors are not as deeply relevant. New Orleans is a city in which these factors are unfortunately not adequately met when it comes to resilience. So we have the natural environment, which is, the nature, the soil we live on, the marshlands, the swamplands, the waterways. We have the built environment, which is the man-made infrastructure. We have the societal environment. This is how society interacts with these other 2 environments and kind of creates things like cultural resilience. It's also very deeply related to historical resilience. And it's very important to understand the history of a specific area, population, society, in order to understand the societal environment. And then we have generalized risk, which covers a kind of a scope of risk in which there's micro communities, macro communities. It's kind of those things that fall into areas that are harder to define, that don't fall under, natural and built environments or kind of sociocultural things. And then governance. And again, this information comes from the EPA. I was talking to Ashley about having this information sent after this, so you could explore this on your own time. So this is what I was talking about. This is called the CRSI score. One thing that's important for you to know if you want to follow information that is very pertinent to disaster, specifically in Louisiana, is that we are in what is called EPA Region 6. And this region as a whole scored a 2.77 out of 10. This score is objectively not great. What you'll see on this map is that the lighter the area, the least resistance. So the highest areas of resistance are these kind of northeastern areas, these western areas. I'm not sure if this will work, but if anyone has a microphone on, does anyone want to comment on why they think the areas in blue have higher resilience indices?
Is it because they're not necessarily near water? Like
near water?
Yeah, I'm guessing.
Well, we have the eastern coast. So I see what you're saying. The eastern coast and the western coast definitely have water on them. But I like that you're actually thinking, there's a lot of issues with water scarcity. We hear a lot about that. So that indices for that particular area might have a heavy environmental burden, but not necessarily a holistically poor resilience burden. So any other thoughts on why these areas? So I think it's a good thing to consider those 5 areas. Let's see if I can go back. So Ashley commented on the natural environment. And so, yeah, we do hear a lot of news coming out here. There's a lot of flooding on these coasts. Some of the worst flooding, almost equivalent to the issues happening in Ile de Jean-Charles, are in Scituate, Massachusetts. So they have very low environmental resilience. What makes a big difference in these areas is infrastructure and resources and governance, and how these particular areas look at resilience, especially as it relates to climate, and then what they actually decide to do as a government. This area is actually really interesting. Anyone have any thoughts on Arizona, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, I believe it's Wyoming? Anyone want to reckon a guess on why they have higher resilience scores? Well, I can tell you, that has more to do with having a small population. So this is not necessarily completely a full picture, but on this right side, we have the considerations. So the coastal South definitely has a lot of issues with water being below sea level, but where it fails, where some of its similar cities don't, are areas in governance, the way risk is managed, and the built environment. And there's definitely a lot of information that you can seek regarding, if you want to compare 2 areas, comparing a state like Massachusetts to a state like Louisiana that have very similar water-related issues, but very, very different approaches. But yeah, I recommend, if you can, looking up the CRSI. index. It's extremely interesting. And so we already talked a little bit about this. This just breaks down what are those concepts in resilience, and how do we really measure the resilience of a specific area. Again, this score is speaking specifically to this region. That also encompasses Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and I believe Arkansas, but I would have to check on that one. So that's not just New Orleans or Louisiana, but it is an overall score. When it is compared to Mississippi and Alabama, there is actually a slightly higher score, but not so significant that you would call it a low risk state. So when we talk about, this is kind of the bread and butter, disaster risk reduction, because we have this information. We have these tools to kind of seek this information, but what do we do with it? So we really want to foundationally start looking at what is called DRR. And DRR is the communicating and understanding of risk. This is a huge topic in disaster risk reduction, disaster resilience. This is really taking all that information that you have and that you gather for your clients, for yourself, for the nation, and figuring out how to direct it towards these people, again, your clients, yourself, the nation, to actually create greater outcomes and to reduce risk. So I added this slide in today to kind of preface a conversation. So one of the most interesting things I think that is coming out in the news are articles related to failures in communication. The NICS one, not so much. This is actually an example of good communication because so NOLA says no to NICS. I'm not sure if you heard about this. NICS wants to run a summer parade, and they communicated directly with NICS to inform them that the issue is that this would take up resources during the summer for disaster management. This is why New Orleans historically does not have too many planned parades in the summer. But these particular areas, Ile de Jean Charles tribe turns down funds to relocate. I'm not sure if you've all been following it. There's a website in which you can follow the progress, but the area of Ile de Jean Charles and the people of Ile de Jean Charles are essentially being forced to move due to climate change and rising sea levels. So one issue here is that this has been communicated over more than 15 years. And now that we're entering kind of the end of the relocation cycle, the relocation planning cycle, people don't want to go. And this is a big problem in communication and kind of the way it was managed, so communication management. An article that just came out, I believe it was June 6th today. Did I look at it? Yep. So June 6th is yesterday. An article, a report has actually been released regarding Homeland Security, essentially changing information regarding how FEMA handled disaster audits. And they used Katrina specifically as the impetus to make, for the reporters to look at this issue. And what was found was that there was gross negligence when it came to communication. And today this is still happening with wildfires, with drought. This is a perpetuated issue. And this piece on the side, this map, is related to an article that I'm going to discuss a little bit later. So when communicating risk with clients, what we really need to understand about this is kind of the foundational part of practice when it comes to disaster resilience, especially as an agency. Again, when we're talking about DRR, we're talking about how do we communicate risk. It's as simple as that, but it's not simple in practice. So simple theory, difficult execution. The thing we need to really understand, I think that many of the agencies on today are very aware of and very skilled at, is that no two communities, agencies, or individuals are perfectly alike, especially in their own chosen risk assessment methods and results. So this is to say that, what I would do is not necessarily what you would do. What one agency would do is not necessarily what another agency would do. Even more important in the context that we're talking about is that a client's personal assessment of risk is often very different than the city, state, or government. And, in disaster risk reduction, what we're talking about here is not only a difficulty in communication around these topics, but also power hierarchy. So this is a really important thing to understand kind of as you move forward in developing your own risk communication practices around disaster is that, it's sometimes this information is being handed down, not laterally, and that changes the relationship and the decision-making capacities and impetuses of our clients, of different communities, and so on. So it's a very important topic. So there are things to consider. I'm not sure, I don't think our microphones are working well. These were some questions that I kind of wanted to pose to you. But when we're developing our communication styles and looking at ourselves as these agencies that are going to be communicating risk, potentially not all agencies do or should do this, but you need to consider first accessibility. And I think New Orleans is actually very good at this. There's a lot of materials in multiple languages. I especially see it in Vietnamese, and that shows that the city is aware that there is a large Vietnamese population and considers that population in need of these materials. We need to consider individual and community needs, and we also always need to consider safety. So some questions we can begin to ask ourselves as personal practitioners, but also agency practitioners are, can my clients access these resources? Further along that thought is, can my clients access these resources in the event of a disaster or in the event of a power outage? I think one of the biggest issues that is arising in this field is, how do we actually disseminate information when we have no power? It sounds like a really obvious and simple question, but I think you'd be surprised as soon as there's a power outage, people realize they don't actually know a lot, and there's not much they can do in regards to their phone. There was actually a power outage in my mom's neighborhood 2 weeks ago, and after she got everything back, her phone was off, all that, she got back to me and said that she had no idea what to do. She didn't even really know her neighborhood well enough to go figure out where to get gas. Of course, this was almost an over exaggeration because this was a very temporary crisis, but the panic was real, because what she realized was that without technology, she didn't know the resources. So, you can ask yourself, can they access it? Do we have something in paper? And how do we disseminate this information to these clients? Again, can my client understand this information? This is not only language, but this is also ability, to read, to comprehend. I believe that the school age level of reading should be below I believe it's the age of 12, but I would need to look at this again. But it has to be accessible. It might be at the 3rd to 5th grade level.
It's definitely under 6th grade.
Under 6th grade? Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. So, that covers, not just language, but also comprehension. And, what access does this community have to education specifically? Does my client need this information? This is a huge question in disaster. It's the question of how much is too much and how much is too little. Is this overwhelming to my client at this time? Is this the right time to give this information? If you're assessing your client, some people might not be ready to have a serious conversation about certain topics that are relevant to disaster. This might be a step-by-step process, where you move forward slowly and kind of considering, what does a disaster look like? Some people might want it all right then, but I think when you're looking or working with your client, it's always important to consider the safety in giving this information. Is this going to stress my patient out more, or I'm saying patients, my client out more than it should? Does this client have enough leaving today? So that's an important part of any agency assessment when working with clients, and also a self-assessment. Sometimes we don't want as much information as we're getting. And finally, and this really relates to what I was just talking about now, is it safe and moral to share this information with my client? There's not too much more that I can say on it without being repetitive, but it's sort of a do no harm model, in which sometimes, you shouldn't withhold information or truths that are pertinent to situations, but sometimes certain clients or populations, the information should be disseminated when certain issues have been tackled first. So when we're considering all this information, we're talking about communication. What I want to be able to do today is offer you tools and that are relevant, that can kind of guide you towards, okay, so yeah, I know risk communication is an issue. What should I be looking at and what should I familiarize myself with in order to help my clients or even my family? There are some very basic information-based tools right here. Again, they all rely on the internet, but these are more prevention-related tools. So today we're talking a lot about developing information that helps us with prevention, specifically around communication. One is the LSC flood map. I have it open already, but I'm a little, the NOLA evacuation map. This is for specifically, good, okay, it opened. So this whole website is extremely useful, NOLA Ready. They also offer text alerts. Again, we're talking about things that require technology. But the NOLA evacuation map is actually done in conjunction with Evacueteer. And this allows people to understand where they can get city assisted evacuation. So this is where that begins, city assisted evacuation, and helps you understand, where you can go. So it's down here a little bit. And so maybe some of you have seen these statues. These are city assisted evacuation sites. So getting a client or yourself familiar with the options and then registering beforehand is extremely, extremely useful. And then NOLA district maps. The interesting thing about these maps, again, these help to assess risk specifically around flooding. There is no risk map for events like tornadoes, heavy electrical activity or electrical storms, mainly because the nature of them is extremely unpredictable. But the city of New Orleans has become very adept at measuring risk when it comes to flooding. So this is a similar map to this, but the thing about this map is it does not adhere to the way that residents or New Orleanians in general may look at their neighborhoods. So it delineates in the way that the city of New Orleans delineates neighborhood. And that's important to understand because some people might identify as living in a neighborhood that is not recognized by the city as an official neighborhood. And again, we talked about EPA Region 6. It's FEMA Region 6, so it's a whole swath of the country. It's not just Louisiana. But if you want to follow news regarding FEMA's activities in Louisiana, you would be looking at FEMA Region 6. Similarly, if you need to contact anyone in FEMA, make complaints, that is FEMA Region 6. So EPA, that's important to understand because that's also a good resource for understanding risk around environmental hazards. So that might include hazardous materials, chemical leaks. This is not something that we worry as much about in the disaster resilience world, but it's important to monitor. And then finally, GOSEP Region 1, that is the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness in New Orleans. So these are all things that are very good to follow, or keywords that you can utilize in Google searches or in your searches and research to better understand, the picture. So CIPRA, this is a flood viewing map. They also are the producers of the Coastal Master Plan, which details our plan for 50 years into the future, and also retrospectively looks into the past to say, like, hey, what progress has been made towards reducing risk and improving resilience. Communication actually comes up quite a bit in CIPRA, so I recommend reading it. There's a link here, which again I'm going to see if Ashley can forward to the participants. And it kind of gives you an idea, again, of what agencies have found looking into specifically Louisiana-based risk. There's a lot of information about risk in general around flooding, but Louisiana is actually lucky to have a lot of information that is very specific to the state and the areas in which people live. So moving forward, again, we're going to still talk about resources, but the most important thing to remember if we're talking about risk communication is be first, be right, and be credible. Does anyone want to comment on what they think this means? Any thoughts at all? I can actually unmute people.
I would say that without the be credible, your clients are going to be unwilling to do, even if you are right at what needs to be done. If you're not credible, your clients are not going to be able to trust you enough to let you do what you need to do. Work with them.
That's wonderful. And who was that speaking?
Samara.
Well, thank you so much. No, that's a fantastic point. So the credibility piece, what is the sustainability of the trust that you've built in the community? You know, if you're telling people on Twitter or Instagram or whatever you're using, text-based text messages, you know, is what you're saying true? Is what you're saying coming from a place of credibility? What is your reputation, and what will the information you disseminate do to your reputation? I think you hit the nail on the head, because this really speaks to who you are and who you will be as an agency should these events happen. Does anyone have any other thoughts about this? Or does it strike any particular ideas?
You do and how good your response is. If you don't have those, then no one recognizes it.
So I heard something, you said something about responses. I'm sorry, it was a little choppy.
That no matter how good your response is, if you don't have these, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, fabulous. That's a huge part of disaster resilience, and when, you know, disaster agencies come together, that's a huge topic that they talk about. It doesn't matter what you do or it doesn't matter what your response is, doesn't matter what you do if the information is not credible. I mean, everything is reliant on your communication skills in those initial moments, the moments during a disaster and after. And we've seen a lot of news around this sort of thing. I think we're very familiar with it. It's something that plays out very slowly, but this can be the difference between, you know, life saved, you know, damages mitigated. I think in a future webinar around disaster, we're going to look at exactly what you're talking about, as well as what competent communication means as it relates to damages that are both direct and indirect. So thank you guys so much for your answers. I mean, you absolutely speak to like what is important in this particular question. So, you know, speaking directly to that kind of idea of, you know, be first, be right, be credible. We talk about be right, be credible. Be first. That is often something I think that is utilized more at the governmental level, but it is also recognizing that, you know, depending on your place in the community, you know, you have to ask the question, is it appropriate if I am the first to, you know, respond to this issue? And if I am the first, you know, then what is the burden of responsibility to be right and credible? So yeah, the whole thing is extremely important. I'd say the last two are more relevant to all agencies and stakeholders. So regardless of, again, when you're communicating, this is the golden rule. CIRC recognizes this is crisis emergency risk communication. I'm going to go ahead and hopefully, I'm like now terrified to get out. I have this opened up, but this is a manual and set of trainings that specifically teach your agency, as well as you as an individual practitioner, how to develop your communication models and then actually utilize them. A lot of it has to do with kind of holding yourself accountable, and it is very much so a checklist for your own due diligence. And yeah, it was developed by the CDC, and they consistently update it to specifically respond to current issues in public health, disaster, and crisis. I know that they released a Zika training 2 to 3 years ago, and they're formulating larger training modules for things that they have identified for 2019. I believe that they're really seriously starting to look at flood management. So this is just kind of a basic introduction on like what this tool does. It again speaks specifically to disaster communication. It helps you determine, again, this is from a personal practice level and an agency level. who your audience is. Some agencies actually don't know who their audience is, and you might even notice that at a governmental level or at a federal level, that they're speaking to a specific population, but they're not hitting all populations. So this toolkit kind of first helps you identify who you're even working with and how they're relevant as it relates to disaster. And then to assess the best methods of communication. Again, to educate leaders on managing conflict and dismantling rumors. So that's that credibility piece. There is an amazing part of this training that walks you through how to identify information that may not be credible. There's also, I believe, technological resources that they added recently that helps you verify the credibility, especially of things like tweets. I don't think Louisiana has anything like an application called Citizen. In New York, there's an application called Citizen, and it's specifically around the recognition of disasters, conflicts, and like local issues. There's a huge issue with monitoring the truth in these issues. So they have tools to help you kind of suss out what in your feeds are relevant. This tool also helps to improve internal communications. It's kind of like doing a monitoring and evaluation course within your own agency. And they do that through scorecards as well as rubrics to measure, how you interact with your clients, how your clients might prefer to be communicated with, as well as your agency credibility. It's actually, I wouldn't use the word brutal, I would use the word honest. It's a very honest scorecard. And it really helps you identify blind spots, which is kind of the whole point of this toolkit, as well as, the exploration into risk communication. You need to know your blind spots. And finally, it helps you assess and weigh the risk of planned or intended communications. So I'm going to show you some examples. Oh, and so yeah, this is how you access it. They have free hard copies. So we were talking before about, how do we adequately prepare and communicate when one of the biggest issues is, the lack of power, access to internet, access to phone. One thing that they will do is send you as many hard copies of manuals and workbooks as you need. And they also have client-based materials. I highly recommend looking into this. The CDC is very willing to send published materials, and a lot of people don't take advantage of it. But it is something that you can have on hand should you lose the capacity to actually engage, in social media or utilizing the internet. And I believe they have these resources in multiple languages. I believe it was English, French, Spanish, and Vietnamese is coming soon. So they have 4 domains. The ones that we're concerned about are trainings, manuals, and toolkits. They have excellent newsletters, though. I am signed up for them, and they often make me aware of things that are happening in the field, and as well as kind of just in general around the world around disaster resilience, but also issues, conflicts, disasters that I had no idea were occurring. And then they are very heavy publishers of materials that are utilized federally and just around the world as kind of like the precedent materials for specific issues. And the recordings, that means video recordings, video trainings. So this is what it looks like when you log in, or when you go to the website. You don't have to log in. You can make an account and take trainings. This specific area the specific page is looking at trainings. You have your webinars directly below, online trainings, which also allow you to become certified in specific areas. This is CDC certification. You can also pursue things like FEMA certifications. It is more of a personal improvement certification. It doesn't have necessarily like recognition across the disaster management domain, but it will absolutely prepare you in the topic that you seek. And then if you do want to request materials in hard copy, that is the link. So again, this is what they offer. This is obviously well past. They record all their webinars, but if there's any particular topic that you want to review that is in the past, they have some really good Zika material, even though that's, fallen out of the news, it's still relevant, not as pertinent currently. But it's good to catch up on some of those older materials and recordings because they're still extremely related to what's happening today. This is the online training manual, and then we have there is the opportunity to do in-person training. it is a very rigorous program, and I do believe that they are able to specifically tailor it to an agency or your agency should you be interested. And that certification holds, a little more weight than like an online training certification. I don't know what I did to make that happen, but oh, maybe I pressed the wrong thing. Okay, so yeah, the manuals and tools. I recommend looking at the CERC manual sometime soon, maybe like this week if you have time. It's really impressive. It talks a lot about utilization of social media, which is one of the topics I found most useful in there. And then it also guides you through how do I have the same effectiveness as social media without using social media? Because one of the greatest awarenesses that the CDC has around disaster management is this upcoming field of we're becoming very tech reliant, and what do we do when that tech is gone? And then they have these like little wallet-sized cards that give you a quick reference guide for what to say in an emergency. And these are things like, if you have trainees working for you who you intend to deploy, or volunteers that you intend to deploy, these are little cards that, teach you how to engage empathetically. They give you cues, I would call them. It's a really good resource for people who maybe haven't received a lot of training but need to be deployed. Of course, the ideal is that, everyone goes into a situation in which they're communicating risk or, within a disaster setting prepared. But they have a lot of resources for agencies and people who maybe haven't had that training before they pursue that kind of care. So I mentioned this before. It comes out, it's in multiple languages. And yeah, 2020, they'll have a Vietnamese version. And again, this is suitable for both agencies and clients. You do have to kind of like dig through the material to figure out what you would want to disseminate. But I do recommend, having some of these things on hand for both yourselves and for your clients. And yeah, we've mentioned this before, specifically what they were talking about. And I do, at the bottom, you see it says CDC's Risk Smart Assessment. I will come back to that in a little bit. But the main thing to know about that is that, risk communication and your agency's risk communication starts with self-assessment. Self-assessment is super hard. And often when you hear about, lack of communication in the news or something like that, one of the first things they'll say is, we need to look back and find out what happened, or we need to reassess and reanalyze how we communicate information. That is what a good agency does. Not everyone has the time, the resource, the power to do this, but if you want to start somewhere, self-assessment is the most important thing you can do. So before you use this tool to kind of pursue that self-assessment, and I'll show you what these assessments look like, you need to have a conversation with yourself and your agency. And these are some questions that, the field recommends that you ask yourself in order to pursue the self-assessment. So you might ask yourself, what is our current model of communication? Does this suit a disaster setting? What can we take from, toolkits like CERC or, other bodies, agencies, something like NOLA Ready that seems successful that we can use? What are our strengths and weaknesses? That's a huge one. And I'm sure that in any agency, this conversation is happening at some point during any particular meeting or year. And then, big question that people forget to ask is who speaks for our agency? In, face of an impending disaster, maybe one where the time frame is a little longer, that might be like a hurricane or a tropical storm, who is going to prepare to speak to our clients and stakeholders about this particular situation? Or is there someone else who's going to speak to people, during this situation? You might have someone in your agency who is extremely competent at the, pre-disaster phase, pre-crisis phase, and you might have someone who, you can depend on to answer those questions during the crisis. And, is that two people? Is that a team? Is that one person? And then, what is the system to approve that information across the board? What do I need to know about my clients and context to communicate effectively? And what materials are we lacking? How do we know how to communicate when we need to? And what resources do we need to do so? So again, this is kind of a question of technology and ability. there are plenty of really well-run agencies that as soon as the power goes out, they're kind of, you know, looking around the room saying, you know, what do we do? So is there anything, I'm going to ask the audience, make sure everyone's unmuted. Is there anything here that you can speak to from your agency that you've spoken to in regards to disaster, or does anything just kind of pop out and you want to explore more?
Some of the information I get from being signed up with Enola evacuation special needs, they, I get alerts sometimes that are like yesterday there was first there was an alert that was like, okay, there's a tornado watch or warning or whatnot, and then a few hours later, all of a sudden they came out with another one that was like, the way it was worded was seek shelter immediately. Yeah. And it was,
Oh, yeah. That's a really, no, I'm sorry.
in its own way, but yeah, no, it was, and then of course, you know, I don't know, it was kind of confusing.
Thank you for bringing that up. That's really important because, you know, there might have been a failure of risk analysis from, you know, a more scientific level. There might have been a failure of chosen communication. What that, you know, message decided to say. Oh, hold on, Habitat can't hear. I'm not sure why. Can you guys hear us?
Yes.
I'm not sure if Habitat can. Would you mind? Oh, I'm actually going to mute everyone and see if this. Can you guys hear us in Habitat? So I'll move forward just in case. Yeah, that's a really important point. It sounds like there was a lot of, you know, issues in understanding the client base, issues in possibly the technology, and then issues with the risk. And that's a huge piece of disaster risk communication. You know, you got to find that person who understands when is right, is the information credible. And I'm not sure if there's a perfect answer, but I think what you brought up is deeply important and relevant. So I'm going to move forward just because we're running out of time and I want to leave time for questions.
Hello?
Yes?
Hello. Hi.
Yes.
This is Habitat. So we can hear you, but we cannot hear the comments from the audience.
Oh. Okay, interesting.
That's
So,
what we were trying to say.
I'm so sorry. Okay, so we were discussing you know, kind of false alerts and like how, you know, chosen communication methods sometimes fail us. And, you know, it kind of calls back to, you know, is it the right information? Is it the right way of communicating it? But I'm going to see if I can work on that, but I'm going to move forward just in the interest of time.
They don't trust anyone.
So I can't really hear what the comment was, but I'm just gonna show you guys the toolkit really quick, and then we'll actually be at the end and have room for questions or comments. So again, this is a self-assessment toolkit. It is brutally honest. It really, you know, makes you look at your agency as well as your own personal practice and say, you know, are you ready to communicate adequately? And are the skills present in your agency? So these are some examples that I wanted you guys to see. Here's another page. It is extremely holistic. It does not really give you any room to hide from yourself. Not to say that any of you have anything to hide from, but I think the purpose of this is to really look at blind spots. And again, that's what we're leading to. And I mean, we all kind of touched upon it in our comments. It's not just the content. It's not just, you know, and what I have to say is important. It's really a matter of the purveyor. You are what really matters in this equation. The information matters so much, but it is about who is giving this information that creates the resiliency in the community and their continued success with that community. And that quote came from a study called Risk Communication Failure Case Study of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. these areas down here are all areas that specifically came out as extremely significant in this study. I think this article is incredible. I'll again try to include this in a future email. So the final tool, I'll be really quick with this one, is CDC Risk Smart. This is a system to detect opportunities to improve and any threats to your reputational risk. It looks a bit like this, and it assesses your past actions and your intended actions in the future and how you may operate. And then kind of gives you a score and says, hey, this is the risk of you giving the wrong information and harming a community, which is what actually just came up in the last question. So, how does this all connect? I think based on the comments and what we've been talking about, it might be obvious to you, but discussing risk is a good opportunity to look at our blind spots and kind of break the ice within our own agencies and start to dismantle things that may not be working. And then finally, so I don't want to kind of beat a dead horse, but using those tools, I really highly recommend you take a look at them today or whenever you have time, and consider where they might have a place in the future of your disaster planning. And how can you cover any of those blind spots you find? And is there a resource to do so? And if not, what can you do to bulk in those resources? So before I end, I just wanted to give you something to do should you be interested in engaging in what's happening now. Tonight, HBO is doing a Vice special on Puerto Rico, and there's a video where you can look at like the trailer, and it's almost all about failed risk communication. I recommend that you read the LA Safe document that just came out in April, and then consider reviewing or assessing your agency's disaster communication plan. It'll help kind of frame your understanding and set us up for a conversation next week. So I'm sorry that I sped to the end. That's everything that we have for this week. Next week, we're really be getting into the grittiness of disaster preparedness and really what we can do as agencies to talk about and prepare our clients in the face of disasters. Are there time? I'm sorry? Ashley, do we have any time for questions?
Yep, you got about 5 minutes.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? And I'm also going to type that out just in case Habitat can't hear us. Oop, 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 oop.
Jen, if you could you share any examples of really good, solid communication that has occurred without electricity?
In any particular context?
Any that come to mind.
Sure. So actually what does come to mind, and it's worth reading about, one country that is highly affected by disasters that usually have a blackout that follows is Japan. They have a really strong agency and community network that deploys literally people on foot to disseminate information. And they have almost like a command center sort of model where people all access a certain point and then take that information and then pass it along varying chains. It's almost like alighting the torch chain. And it's a community-based model where they depend on leaders in specific agencies, but then leaders that are identified in the community to be kind of that bridge between the agency and community. And then those community members kind of recruit other community members. I can send some information specifically on these community-based models. But when it comes to lack of technology, the greatest strength in disasters seems to have been community ability to communicate in a way that agencies can't always do. And that's the nature of the relationships. But post-Kobe earthquake was a very good example of a lack of technology. That was 1995, so the technology wasn't really there. But the use of community models persists because of the success of that post-1995 earthquake. There are plenty more, but I can definitely continue, send some of that on because it's very interesting.
Great.
Any other questions? I'm sorry again that we kind of rushed at the end, but I think we have a good foundation to step forward with. Okay, great. If we don't have any more questions, I think we can close the session. I'm really happy to have spoken to you guys and heard your opinions. I really appreciate your attendance. I promise next week we'll continue the conversation and that it will be very interesting.
All right. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. So next week on Tuesday, we will resume with financial planning. Have a good weekend and happy Friday.
Happy Friday, y'all.